In this documentary, we celebrate the 150 years of Auburn, Maine. The good times, the hard times, the first steps, and where we are now. Today, we look back on the history of our city and truly see what makes Auburn, Auburn. When Lewiston was part of Lincoln County, it was difficult for residents to make it to Wiscasset, which is where the county seat was located. At this time, Auburn was part of Cumberland County. It was impractical to have the twin cities in different counties. Different ideas were brought to the table, including possibly having Lewiston become part of Cumberland County. Eventually, it was decided that there would be a new county. Lewiston was chosen to be the center, and Auburn took the county seat since there were more people west to the Androscoggin River at the time. The Treaty of Portsmouth was a document created to end the tension between the Eastern Abenakis and the British colonies. This treaty was to renew a treaty previously made in 1693. The Penobscot Purchase preceded the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was land bought by a group of people from Boston and Portsmouth. In 1736, the Massachusetts General Court granted land to veterans of the Battle of Quebec, though settlement was postponed until after the French and Indian War. Auburn was first settled in 1786 as part of Bakerstown before it was renamed Poland in 1795 by the Massachusetts General Court. Auburn was then part of Minot, which was incorporated in 1802. Then, Auburn became its own city on February 24, 1842. The name Auburn was inspired by a town featured in the 1770 poem The Deserted Village by Oliver Goldsmith. When it first became a city, it was part of Cumberland County until it got the county seat for Androscoggin upon its creation in 1854. As Auburn gained land from the towns around it, including Minot, Danville, and parts of Poland, Auburn grew to be one of Maine's municipalities. It also became one of the first cities in Maine to adopt a council-manager form of government. Farms spread and prospered, but after the arrival of the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad in January of 1848, Auburn became more dependent on manufacturing. Mills operated on water power from the Great Falls and Androscoggin River. Shoe manufacturing started in 1835. Other companies produced textiles, bricks, and furniture. French-Canadian immigrants swarmed to the shoe factories, their population steadily increasing from 12,000 in 1890 to 46.2% of the population in 2010. North Auburn looks out on Lake Auburn, with the Androscoggin River to the east, the city to the south, and the White Mountains on the horizon. Settlers began arriving to North Auburn in 1789, building on the original land grants. In the years 1820 to 1830, the town was booming. Homes were being built and businesses founded, and Nehemiah Packard built a stone dam and sawmill on the inlet of Lake Auburn. In 1825, Joseph Sargent established a tannery along the same inlet. A fulling mill and furniture shop were also constructed there. After the children of the early settlers became adults and started their own families, they began building their own houses. The descendants of Timothy Bailey built half of the North Auburn village. In the 1840s, shoe businesses arrived. In 1848, John Cobb and Moses Harris opened the first shoe factory of North Auburn. Also at this time, there were lumber, tanning, and fulling mills, a grist mill, furniture shop, stores, a hotel, a school, and a doctor. A cemetery association was founded in 1852, which bought a large amount of land to use for the deceased. During the 1850s, a town farm was built on the lake by Harlow's Point, and in the 1860s, there were about 300 inhabitants of North Auburn. A stage route ran through the village from Lewiston to Auburn. It carried passengers, mail, and the occasional shopping list from a village housewife. At various times, there were trucking businesses for the city and other towns. In 1874, citizens of North Auburn and Dillingham Hill formed a stock company and started a shoe factory. It was a large business until it closed in about 1880. Hotels became popular in the 1880s, and the Lake Auburn House was built in 1878 on Lake Auburn's west shore. This hotel was also where the first telephone of the town could be found in 1881. Because North Auburn was not part of the railway, the shoe businesses left the village in the last few years of the century. Several of the vacant homes were burnt in a 30-year span, including the firehouse, shoe shop, and 2 hotels. Even though times were evolving, the citizens of North Auburn continued their way of life. Dillingham Hill had many farms until the end of World War II. In the 1930s, the Auburn Water District bought a lot of the land around the lake shore and planted pine trees. Before, most of this land was clear for farming purposes, but forests now enclosed the lake. Roads were tarred, and it became much easier to travel to the city. Since then, North Auburn has become an attractive suburb. East Auburn is located only a few miles north of the county courthouse at the outlet of Lake Auburn. It was settled as part of Minot in the late 1700s. For some time it was called Berry's Mills, then to Vickery's Mills. Samuel Berry is believed to have been the first white settler in the village and granted a large tract of land at the lake outlet. This grant was given because of his scout service and guide on the Arnold expedition. An important family of East Auburn are the Watermans. Noah Waterman was a Revolutionary War soldier from Halifax, Massachusetts. He came to Maine with his 3 sons and settled on now what is called Waterman Road. From the very beginning, the East Auburn settlement was an important industrial center. Power for water wheels came from the outlet stream by the lake, then called Wilson Pond. Samuel Berry built 2 mills, a grist mill and a sawmill, and William Briggs bought up the second sawmill in 1797. Among the earliest industries were the bobbin mill, for which Bobbin Mill Brook got its name, a carding mill, grist mills, blacksmith shops, and small shoe shops. An account from 1859 reported several businesses: several shoe shops, 2 stores, 2 shoe factories, 1 brush factory, 1 carding machine, 1 peg factory, 1 grist mill, 1 sawmill, 1 shingle, 1 clapboard, and 1 planing machine. Manufactured items include shooks, sugar boxes, staves, bobbins, shoe pegs, and brushes. In the early 20th century, many East Auburn industries became impractical due to electricity and engines. Water power was no longer necessary, so most industries moved to the city for transportation, similar to West Auburn. East Auburn has transformed from an industrial center to a quite quiet residential village, resulting in a more relaxed suburban area. West Auburn borders Minot on one side and Lake Auburn on another. Because of its border with Minot, West Auburn was once East Minot. Settlers began arriving to East Minot in 1789. In 1805, the first Congregational church was built, adding to a store, stage depot, sawmill, and blacksmith shop. In 1835, the first shoe factory was built, presidented by Asaph Howard. In 1842, the first Auburn Town meeting was held in the Congregational church. The name of the post office changed to West Auburn 5 years later. During the next 30 years, the neighborhood of West Auburn was prosperous. When the railroads arrived in Auburn, shoe businesses left West Auburn to be closer to transportation. As a result, businesses in West Auburn decreased from 1890 to the early 1900s. A few houses that were built in the 1800s have been burnt down, but most were remodeled. During the First World War, a Red Cross unit was formed and stayed active until the end of the Second World War. The Congregational Church was an important piece of early West Auburn, and members of West Auburn joined the North Auburn Grange, bringing West and North Auburn closer together. The Wallingford families became interested in apple growing, therefore Perkins Ridge became a sea of apple trees, with the apples being sent to places such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. The West Breeze Corporation bought Bancroft Wallingford Orchards in 1968. Lost Valley was founded in 1961, further improving life in West Auburn. Before it was Lake Auburn, the water source was known as Wilson Pond. Boats gathered to the lake from the late 1800s to the early 1900s, transporting passengers to hotels along the shores of the lake. The first steamer for the lake was launched on June 6, 1868, named Lady of the Lake. Another ferry, the Yosemite, began operation in 1879. After 1 year of its service, the Yosemite was shipped to Lake Maranacook, where it became the steamer Androscoggin. In 1881, the ferry City of Auburn ran for 3 years. In 1884, a steamboat was built in Bath named the Frank A. Hale after the owner of a hotel on the west shore of the lake. After the hotel changed hands, the steamer was renamed the City of Lewiston. After going on Lake Auburn for hundreds of times, it was beached and left to rot when it was then destroyed by a fire. The last time it was on the lake was when Theodore Roosevelt came to Lewiston in 1916. Before Genesee and Wyoming owned the tracks, there was the Grand Trunk Railroad. The main GTR tracks ran from Portland, Maine to Sarnia, Ontario. Its headquarters was in London, England. On November 10, 1852, the railroad was put into use. In 1853, GTR bought the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railroad. By 1867, it became the largest railway system after gaining 1,277 miles of track throughout New England and Canada. In 1923, GTR was absorbed into the Canadian National Railways. Since August 8, 1933, the only railroad in Auburn, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic, uses the old GTR railways to transport goods throughout Maine and eastern Canada. Some of those goods include concrete, propane, paper pulp, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, anhydrous ammonia, water, telephone poles, logs, treated wood products, scrap metal, grain, corn, wheat, stone, heating oil, rail, appliances, wind turbine blades, and plate steel. Had the railroad not been built in the city, many of the factories of East, West, and North Auburn would have stayed in those areas, making them less residential and more similar to what New Auburn is today. For 56 years, Barker Mill was one of Auburn's leading companies in the textile industry. It helped to jumpstart New Auburn as a business center and gave it the opportunities to grow. A large area of land was bought near the Little Androscoggin by a group of men called the Little Androscoggin Water Power Company. They wanted to develop a water power for a textile mill using hydroelectricity. That required a power dam, which was completed in 1872. The mill was finished in 1873 and named Barker Mill after C.I. Barker, a prominent textile executive, who became its first directing agent. In 1874, the mill began production of cotton shirtings and sheetings. By 1888, it employed 275 people and made 4 million yards of goods. Since then, it has been occupied by the Koss Shoe Company and is now residential housing. After the Civil War, the shoe industry had grown steadily. At the turn of the century, the shoe industry became the economic backbone of Auburn. Taking advantage of the hydroelectric power, machinery, and shoemaking techniques, the next 20 years were very prosperous. During the closing year of the Civil War, Auburn shoe factories produced 600,000 pairs of footwear, which doubled the amount 4 years previous. Come 1900, it was 6 million pairs. At the beginning of the Civil War, Auburn had 23 shoe factories that relied on outwork in homes. Due to the calling into military service, many shoemakers had to leave the factories. Because of this, many factories decided to add machinery to replace the manual labor of the workers. Even though some companies chose to do this, some took time to modernize and rather kept the technique of outwork. R.L. Cushman was easily one of the most influential members of the industry. He moved his factory from Minot to Auburn in 1863. After the end of the Civil War, he built himself a brick factory on Court Street and became the first in the city, second in the state, to install a Mackay stitcher. Mackay stitchers could sew the upper part of the shoe directly onto the sole. It could accomplish this task in 1 minute, which would otherwise take an hour by hand. In doing this, Cushman got much more business. He could now sell $2.50 shoes for $2. By 1917, Auburn was producing 75% of the world's supply of white canvas shoes. Sadly, the industry began to diminish after World War II, with most of the factories closing. In 1972, the Cushman Hollis building was torn down, while hundreds of people looked on. It was the Shoe City landmark, and by its removal, Auburn left the shoe industry behind. New Auburn was founded by the Little Androscoggin Water Company, which built a dam and Barker Mill. Because of this, the area that would become New Auburn was known as Barker's Mills. The corporation built houses for its employees, as that was common at the time. Aside from a few farms along the edge of the area, there were only 7 buildings. The 8th, 9th, and 10th structures built by the Little Androscoggin Water Company were destroyed in the fire of 1933. A man named Edward Byron was superintendent of the Barker Mills gas manufacturing works and yard boss. During this time, gas was used for lighting. Byron laid out the streets in New Auburn for Little Androscoggin Water Company, which began a domino effect of the buying and selling of land to settlement. Bisecting numbering streets were named after power company directors. For example, Pulsiver, Cook, Gill, Roque, Loring, and Foster. English, Irish, Franco-Americans, Jewish, Polish, and German settlers soon flocked to New Auburn. New Auburn was described as paradise for the first few years after river flooding had made the lands incredibly fertile. Wild grapes could be found everywhere, and the Androscoggin had an abundance of fish. There was even a ferry that would go between Lewiston and New Auburn. On the afternoon of May 5, 1933, the community was hit by an inferno, which destroyed 249 buildings, the heart of the business section, left over 2,000 people homeless, and caused a loss of about $2 million. Repair and reopening of the businesses took over a year. If this fire hadn't happened, it is very possible that New Auburn would have continued its improvements for many more generations, making it a nicer neighborhood today. One of the most famous natural disasters that affected Auburn was the flood of 1936. The winter preceding the flood was abnormally snowy, with 17 different snowstorms and no effective thaws. The warm front in March caused the most serious, record-breaking flood ever witnessed on the Androscoggin River. Both Auburn and Lewiston had parts that were completely submerged, and many houses were flooded. Over 2,000 families were left temporarily homeless. Utilities were damaged and destroyed, and sanitation work was desperately needed after the water levels returned to normal. Surprisingly, no lives were lost in Lewiston or Auburn. Strangely enough, the year ended with a balanced budget and a net decrease in debt. Another natural disaster was the Great Ice Storm of 1998. 5 inches of freezing rain hit a narrow route of Canada and New England, Auburn included. It caused major tree and electrical damage. Millions were left without power for days, weeks, and even months. It caused 35 fatalities throughout the whole storm and left 700,000 Maine residents without electricity. The Maine National Guard was mobilized, and utility crews from as far away as North Carolina came to help with repair. In more recent times, a windstorm hit Auburn rather hard in October of 2017. A peak wind gust was recorded at 69 miles per hour, causing widespread power outages and fallen trees. Over 368,000 homes in Maine were left without power. This storm was even stronger than the storm of 1998. Trees, power lines, and water left many roadways blocked off. 50 U.S. Coast Guard vessels broke free from their moorings, some remaining adrift, while others washed up on shore. Though the money didn't go to Androscoggin County, $4.7 million of federal funds were given to Maine to help repair damage made. Apples have always been a popular fruit. At first, it was used for hard cider, dried apples, applesauce, or apple pie. After 1830, grafting was popular, and there were many varieties crafted that had short popularity. Some of the best grafted apples are Macintosh, Red Delicious, and Golden Delicious. The orchards on Perkins Ridge were developed by Bancroft Wallingford, Otto Wallingford, John Wallingford, and Eugene Wallingford. They were some of the most prosperous orchards in not only Maine, but also the entire Northeast. In 1968, the Bancroft Wallingford farm was sold to West Breeze Orchards Incorporated, another nice orchard belonging to Philip Hitt of West Auburn. Many smaller orchards can also be found around Auburn. Before Lost Valley was a ski mountain, it was an area that local children knew about and used for themselves. Lost Valley was accessible by old trails and pathways for decades until 1960. In the fall of 1960, owners Otto Wallingford and Dr. Camille Gardner tested snow accumulation and cover in the valley itself. The results were the first domino that set the ski resort into motion. In September of 1961, the development of the ski mountain began. 8 acres worth of slope were cleared, and a rope tow line was graded to the land, 700 feet long with a drop of 140 feet. The lodge was also built, complete with log siding and a fireplace. On January 6 of 1962, Lost Valley Ski Area was open to the public. After only 2 weeks of use, a rainstorm turned one side of the mountain into a sheet of ice. However, the storm sparked the first artificial snowmaking installation in Maine. Though the first spray of man-made snow to the valley was only needed for 30 minutes before natural snow started falling. In the summer of 1962, a T-bar, expert slope, and intermediate area was added. The parking area was also enlarged. In 1963, beginners' trails were formed. In 1964, a ski jump was constructed and a new snow tractor was purchased. Over the next year, 3,000 square feet of lodge and ski shop were added. Each year since, Lost Valley has made more improvements. Come 1968, there were 45 acres of skiable area, lifts capable of transporting 3,400 people per hour, 3.5 miles of cross-country trails, and a skiing complex for competitive training. As this documentary has proven, Auburn has gone through many ups and downs throughout its history. Though it is for certain that there will be more hardships, it is even more obvious that the positive times will outweigh the negative. Until then, we will watch our city grow and carry on the memories for generations to come.